Chapter 8. Bainland. The next few days passed with no further incident, for which the prince was grateful. He didn't know what had passed between the girl and the giant when they had been alone in the woods, but by unspoken consent, the prince was allowed to ride unbound. He expected the girl to demand that now that he could move about freely, he and she take turns riding the horse, but she didn't. Instead, she chose to walk, and more often than not was off in the woods scouting ahead or behind, claiming when the prince asked that she moved better without a clumsy beast of burden beneath her. "Ride if you want," she said. "My own legs are good enough for me." "Very well," he said, not understanding but not particularly caring. "I'll be ranging ahead, Tomaz," she said, ignoring the prince, which was what she did now as long as he wasn't talking to her, sometimes even then. As she left, Tomaz chuckled quietly and pulled his charger back to walk beside the prince's horse, which shied away from the huge stallion before calming itself. "What's funny?" the prince asked, perhaps a touch too early. He had decided to try to keep up the friendly rapport that he had established with Tomaz until they reached Bainland, though he still wasn't exactly certain how to make it happen without it sounding forced. "Nothing in particular," Tomaz replied with a friendly smile, "just remembering something she said many years ago." There was a pause in which neither of them spoke, and the prince feared that that would be the end of the conversation. But for some reason he could not bear silence today, and so he asked the first question that came to mind. "How long have you known her?" The words came out slightly too quickly, but Tomaz appeared not to notice and replied in his customary slow rumble. "Since she became an exile." The prince, surprised, looked over at the big man, who appeared to be lost in thought. "How long ago was that?" The giant looked about to respond, but then caught himself and turned to the prince with a smile. "Long enough. It's not my story to tell." And with that, the conversation did end, and they remained silent for the rest of the day's journey, even though the prince tried to come up with something to say multiple times. It was infuriating. He had grown up a natural at court politics, and yet he couldn't hold a conversation with a simple base-born exile. It was baffling. The next few days continued much the same, with barely any conversation on any of their parts. Tomaz taught the prince a few more impromptu names of trees and plants, and though the prince tried to appear interested, Tomaz soon realized he wasn't, and so the lessons ended. The girl was gone during most days, apparently having taken it upon herself to do most of the scouting. She only returned for brief intervals to speak quietly to Tomaz, and then at night when they made camp. A few times the prince caught her looking at him across the fire at night. As soon as his eyes met hers, though, she looked away, and either engaged Tomaz in conversation or else made an excuse to walk away from the fire. The looks varied. Some were oddly subdued and thoughtful, as if she were waiting for something, while others were angry and uneasy, as if she were impatient for that something to happen. The prince wasn't sure what to make of this, but as he remained unbound, he told himself it was none of his concern. Neither of them were his concern, after they'd reached Bainland and he made his way into the city without them. And finally, that day came. Close to noon, they emerged from a dense thicket of trees to find themselves on a ridgeline that overlooked the city. It was still miles distant, and it would take them the rest of the day to arrive there, but the prince felt anticipation rush through him, and suddenly his nerves were on edge. Even from a distance he could tell that the city must be Bainland. It was located at the center of an enormous fork made of 3 well-paved stone roads, each wide enough, it was said, for half a dozen carts to travel abreast. One road curved off to the east eventually, once it crossed the riverlands, and led to the city of Formaux, the seat of his brother Tiffanel, the Prince of Foxes. The road that led north went to the city of Lerne, nestled in the rolling hills that spread through central Lucien, the seat of his sister Samantha. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, the road that led south eventually ended in Rourke, the seat of Ramel, the Prince of Oxen, and also the end of the Empire. The city of Bainland itself could more properly be called a city within a city, or better yet, a city within a town. The middle city had been built when his mother, with Ricard and Joffred by her side as her right and left hands, had begun to solidify her rule of Lucia and began her second great conquest of the southern realms. The original wall of Bainland, known as the Black Wall, had been built to withstand both time and attack, and as such had never fallen to any enemy. From where he sat on his horse, the prince could see the top of it, rising out of the city like an enormous black stone curtain, forming a large parallelogram around Bainland City, which was a city devoted almost entirely to commerce. It was unparalleled in the rest of the known world, and was the source of various expressions along the lines of, "I bet I couldn't even find it in Bainland," or, "Well, we could always move to Bainland and try our luck." Inside this wall was Bainland City proper, where lived the elevated, the high blood, and the most high blood, who owned the city and the land surrounding it. Toward the center of the city proper was another wall, inside of which only the children and the Most High could go. The inner city was made of towering stone structures that stretched high into the air, spearing the heavens with their spires. Unlike the Black Wall, these buildings had never felt the touch of the Empress, and as such had been worn down and rebuilt over time. The prince had heard that they came nowhere close to rivaling the majesty of the Black Wall, but were still tall and powerful, and some, the Cathedral of the Empress among them, breathtaking in their own right. The outer city, the town spread around the walls of what was historically Bainland City proper, was actually 3 very large towns that had sprung up outside the walls. No one was allowed to pass beyond Bainland's Black Wall who was not an elevated merchant, tradesman, or one of the high blood, and so, over the years, the lower classes who lived outside the wall had built second-hand shops, teetering inns, and rickety wooden houses that had melded into a haphazard city of its own that was like a wooden maze. This outer city was broken into 3 large sections, each of which was centered on one of the Black Wall's 3 gates, the Learn Gate, the Formeau Gate, and the Rourke Gate, named after the primary trade objectives toward and from which goods flowed. For, first and foremost, Bainland was a trading city, and important because it was located almost squarely at the center of the empire, and as such served as the empire's central trading hub. If Lucien was the head of the empire, Bainland could very well be called its heart, and the roads that led from it the arteries that fed the empire's lifeblood, trade, to all corners of Lucia. And somewhere in that mess, thought the prince, is the path of light that will lead me to the Seeker. Shadows and fire, it always takes my breath away to see that sight. It's a beautiful city. If by beautiful city you mean a cesspool of corruption, then yes, it is. The prince, by now used to the way the exiles came and went with barely any sound, managed not to jump when the girl spoke from right behind him, but only just. He looked at Thomas and saw the exile staring at him, still atop his charger. It took him a split second to realize the giant expected him to be surprised. "Bainland," he said, trying to play it off as though the sight had struck him momentarily dumb. You've brought us to Bainland." "Yes, we did," the girl said. "Why?" he asked, keeping his demeanor calm and collected. Inside, however, he was filled with a sudden mix of conflicting emotions. "Bainland, it's right there. It's there. I need to get there. I need to..." But he would wait. He had waited this long, and he could wait a little longer. He needed to make a clean escape, needed to make sure Thomas and the girl couldn't follow him, or at least couldn't catch up to him until he was safe inside the city, and preferably safe inside the Seeker's lair. And then, once he was there, things would be worked out. They had to be. There was nowhere else for him to go. "We need supplies," Thomas said, dismounting. With a sudden thrill that jolted through his body to the tips of his fingers and toes, the prince realized that this would be his chance. They were making camp for the day. "We aren't going closer?" he asked. "Why would we?" the girl replied, looking at him suspiciously. "I'm not sure. I suppose I'm just so used to traveling until dusk that stopping to camp at noon is strange to me." Thomas grunted in what the prince felt was agreement and began to unburden his horse of the heavier saddlebags. The answer seemed to please the girl, who grimaced and began to unpack the food. "If there was anywhere else to go, we'd keep going. But any closer and we'd run the risk of being found by a patrol, and any farther away we'd be too far to make the journey in half a day." "Speaking of which," Thomas said, "I could make it there and back by sunset." "You?" she asked. "I thought I was going. I always go." "Yes, but I want to make sure you have a path. I have a feeling that by now our friend the prince is known to be alive, and they may also suspect he's making his way to Bainland, with or without our company." "That is if the Death Watchman left any record of where they were going to hunt for him. Is that likely?" She turned to the prince. "No," he responded truthfully, trying to keep up the facade of being helpful for just a little while longer. All he needed was for the big man to leave him and the girl alone. Death Watchmen are notorious for following a trail to its end and only reporting back once the task is complete. "The assassination, you mean?" the girl muttered, though there was no heat in it. She seemed preoccupied, and had not the prince been so lost in his own thoughts he would have found that peculiar. But, as it was, he let it go, still trying to will Tomas to leave. As if on cue, the big man finished tying off his charger, dumped his bags at the base of a nearby oak tree, and pulled the hood of his long, gray-and-brown cloak up and over his head, obscuring his face and the hilt of his greatsword. "I should be back before sunset," he rumbled, and with that he remounted and urged his horse in the direction of the city. The prince dismounted as if in a dream. Everything felt suddenly too slow, as if it was all happening to someone else or was part of another man's life that he could only just remember. The exile girl turned to set her packs by Tomas's, and the prince's gaze fell on the pair of short swords they had taken from the dead soldiers after the fight with the Death Watchman. Time passed slowly and yet quickly, and after a few moments, he knew Tomas was out of hearing range. The girl still had her back turned and was rifling through the packs looking for something. The prince reached out and grabbed one of the short swords, everything still fuzzy and confused. The sword had been well oiled by Tomas, and when he drew the black metal from its sheath, there was no sound. He knew from his training that to hesitate once an action was in motion was to fail. As a son of the Empress, as one of the children, he had been conditioned from a very early age to set aside all feeling and to simply and effectively follow a plan of action. And so, very calmly and without hesitation, he came up behind the girl and raised the sword. But at the last second she turned, and her green eyes met his. He paused. The sword hung in the air for a second too long, and in that time the shock and surprise that crossed her face disappeared. Coming back to himself, he brought the sword down, but the girl was no longer there. He spun, striking for her again as she nimbly dodged away, but he sliced through only air. Her hands fell to her hips, and suddenly her daggers were in her hands, and the prince knew that he needed to end this fight, now. Without pausing to consider his actions, he turned and hurled the short sword, end over end at the girl. Taken completely by surprise, she jerked her daggers up in front of her face, and just managed to deflect the sword, sending it spinning into the forest. But the prince didn't even spare it a second glance. Instead, he stepped forward, feinted left, turned right, and struck the girl in the gut. With a whoosh, the breath rushed out of her lungs, and she staggered back a step, staring wide-eyed at the prince, mouth open in disbelief and fear. He felt something lurch in his stomach, but his body moved mechanically, and in quick succession he struck the girl's wrists, kidneys, and the nerve that ran up the side of her neck. She fell to her knees, temporarily paralyzed. Her hands fell limply to her sides, and the daggers dropped from her twitching fingers as she stared helplessly up at him. As he looked at her, his chest began to ache, and once again he faltered. "Don't stop! Now you're almost free!" With a clenched fist, he struck her temple, and she fell to the forest floor. For a long moment he stood over her. Some time passed, he wasn't sure how much, and he just stared at her, unable to look away. Slumped over as she was, she looked almost dead. He came back to himself with a start. He needed to move, and move now before Tomas returned. There was no time to reflect or think. He needed to reach the Seeker. Once there, everything would be well. He would contact his mother, and he would return triumphant, having passed the test and proved himself worthy. Turning, he made his way to the pack horse and pulled out the strips of fabric that were left over from his bonds. Wrapping them together, he moved to the girl and tied her hands behind her back, then lashed her feet together in an intricate knot, as intricate as he could manage, and finally tied her to a tree, feeling all the while a kind of vindictive satisfaction in doing to her what she had so often done to him. He finished as quickly as he could and pulled away. Time was of the essence. As he turned to go, he happened to look down and see the girl's daggers. He might need a weapon. He bent and reached for one. Searing pain raced through his hand, up his arm and into his head as he grasped the hilt. His vision dissolved into swirls of white smoke, and it felt as though a blanket had been pressed against his ears, mouth, and nose, blocking out every sense of the world around him. Paralysis crept into his lungs as he tried to breathe, forcing his hand tighter around the burning hilt. With a supreme effort of will, he let out a cry and released the dagger. He staggered back several feet and fell to the ground, watching in alarm as the dagger smoked in the grass where it had fallen. He looked at his hand and saw that an outline of the hilt had been burned into his skin. As if activated by his sight, the wound began to throb with a sickening intensity. "Shadows and light!" he cursed. A twig snapped off to his right, and his whole body surged with energy as he whipped around. But there was nothing there, only a small, furry creature, some kind of bushy-tailed rodent that quickly climbed a tree. He resaddled the pack horse. He decided to take nothing with him but a full waterskin. He left both short swords behind, and then mounted the beast. With a quick kick in the ribs, he sent the animal speeding away. The exile girl named Leah lay at the base of the tree to which he'd tied her for a long time. She regained consciousness some time later, and though her first instinct was to sit up straight and look around for the shadow-cursed princeling, she remained still, knowing the wave of nausea that followed head trauma would hit her soon. Just as expected, as her body woke up, her stomach began to do backflips, and her vision swam even though she had yet to open her eyes. For a moment or two she let the feeling wash over her, then she slowly sat up and took a deep breath to still herself. The throbbing in her head continued, but the nausea in her stomach quickly passed. Slowly she opened her eyes and let out a partially stifled moan as rays of light stabbed at her and sent needles of pain down her spine. Her sides ached where the princeling had struck her, but her hands, while still numb, at least seemed to be working properly, likely indicating no serious damage. The memory of the prince's attack flashed through her mind, and she, grudgingly, marveled at how well trained he was. She looked around and saw that the pack horse, Trudger, was gone. The packs were still there, though hers had been torn open. The only noticeable thing missing, though, was the largest of the waterskins. She stood up, only to fall back down halfway through the motion as she was forcibly reminded that she was tied to the tree against which she had been propped. "Lovely," she grumbled. She arched her neck to try and get a look at the knots that bound her, but her head began to pound so horribly that she was forced to close her eyes and lean back lest she retch all over herself. After the wave of sickness had passed, she opened her eyes again and realized that, even though the light appeared far too bright, the sun had begun to sink in the west and dusk was only an hour or two away. Shadows had begun to cloak the area under the trees, all stretching off to the east. She'd been sitting there unconscious for the better part of the day. Tomas should be back any time now. As if summoned by her thought, there came the crackle of rustling leaves, and the Ashandel appeared at the campsite. He pulled up short as he took in the scene. Shock and dismay crossed his face, and in a swirl of his long cloak he was off his horse, Malial, and racing toward her, his great sword, Malachi, unsheathed in his hand. He dropped to her side and picked up a dagger, which had been lying on the forest floor beside her. Her dagger. Yes, she remembered now, that was where they had fallen. Tomas sheathed Malachi, and with 3 quick slashes of the dagger freed her, cutting the bonds around her wrists and ankles. "What happened?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "The princeling made his escape." Leah was not the kind of person to be vindictive, at least not toward her friends, but she could not help feeling a kind of twisted pleasure in saying those words to Tomas, who had been so convinced that the child was no more than a misunderstood boy. Her head gave another nasty throb and she sucked in a hissing breath. The Ashandel stared at her for a long time. "Where would he go?" "Bainland," she said immediately. "I've known ever since he gave that speech that he would go there. You and I both know that there's a hooded one there, and not just any seeker but a shadow lord, and the prince will lead us right to him. I knew he would make his move when you left. I had planned to let him lose me when he made his escape, but he's more ruthless than I expected and he attacked me. What matters is that we have a way into Bainland now, a way to find the Seeker. If we go now, we can catch him. Tomas, after all the time we spent trying to find a way into the Hooded One's hideout, now the prince will lead us right to him if we follow him quickly enough. We'll have the Seeker and the prince both." If Leah had expected praise, she was sorely disappointed. A number of emotions crossed Tomas's face, but none of them were pleasant. Finally, his expression settled on fury. Leah felt a sudden twinge of fear and a sense of vertigo. Many times she had seen that look on Tomas's face, but never once had it been directed at her. For the first time, she felt the way countless others must have felt before their lives had been ended by the dazzling steel of the giant's greatsword. "You let him go, knowing it might lead to his death." It was not a question, nor was it a statement. It was an accusation. "Yes," she said, as calmly as she could, though inside she was shaking. Years of working with Tomas had taught her that while her moral compass sometimes went awry, his did not. He always did what was right, and such fury as creased his features was reserved only for those who violated his moral code. "I knew he would never change," she said, trying to explain herself. Tomas was her closest companion, her best friend. She knew that he would understand, and see her reasons as valid if only she could explain them. When he talked about death the way he did, I could see he would never be free of his mother's control. In his eyes, the tyrant is the only one who can save him from himself. He sees himself as cursed. He is cursed. And his precious god Empress is the only one who can keep him sane. He doesn't know how to live with himself without her. The tyrant is the only one he will ever trust. He's broken, Tomas. There is no saving him. And this way, he'll lead us right to the Seeker's lair, right to the heart of their organization. He knows we're outside Bainland, and that's the only place left he can go. When he attacked me, I could see it in his eyes. He didn't want to hurt me, but he did anyway. He's a zealot of the worst kind. He knows what he does is wrong, and yet he does it anyway. He thinks the Empress, the tyrant of Lucia, is the only solution. There is no saving him. Tomas's expression had not changed. His eyes, like chips of black ice, chilled her and dug into her conscience. And as she finished, she knew what she had done was wrong in his eyes, and that was almost more than she could bear. "Everyone can be saved," he said, so intensely that she felt the vibration in her bones. "And what you have done is allow an innocent boy to walk into the open arms of his murderers. While you were looking for advantage when he spoke of death, I was looking into a mirror. Well you know my tale, and well you should know that this boy is just like me. Just like you, too." She recoiled as if burned. "He's nothing like me," she hissed. "He's a spoiled prince who has lived his entire life in command of the people of Lucia, sitting in luxury born on the backs of slaves." "He is a tortured mind who knows more of compassion than any living man I have ever met. If he can be shown a better way, if we can bring him to the kindred and show him that the Empire does not need to rule supreme, then we can truly begin to change things. And, most importantly, we can change him. I see myself in him, and I see you in him. I see every man, woman, and child who has lived under the Empress and accepted her rule simply because they have food to eat and know nothing better. He is the key, Eshendai. This boy will change everything. And should that change happen, there will be no need to send him or anyone else in as bait for the hooded ones." Leah stared at Tomas for a long time, not knowing how to respond. When she did speak, her voice was soft and weak, confused and halting. I can't see that far ahead, Tomas." "Neither can I," he rumbled back. The fury finally gone, but the sharp intensity still present, like a bar of heated steel cooled and hardened into the form of a sword. "The path will come in time. All I know is that the boy is good. There is a spark in him that has been smothered for years, but it has not gone out. Not yet. He can be redeemed. The way he spoke, he knows life and the cost of death better than anyone. He knows what it is to feel another person's pain, something none of his siblings have ever known, something their mother was never able to teach them." "He's not different from them, Tomas. He's one of the children." "He is different, Eshendai," he said, "in all the ways that matter, in all the ways that make them monsters, in all the ways that leave him as nothing more than a scared boy trying to fill a role he never wanted." "I know you, Tomas, and for all your talk of changing the Empire, that is not why you are doing this. What is it about him that affects you so?" The giant paused. "A debt I owe to the man who saved my life," he said finally. "What debt?" Leah asked. "I know your entire life story, Tomas, but I know of no debt that would ask this loyalty from you." "I will tell you when the time is right. As you said, you know me, and you know I would not keep this from you without good reason." Leah was about to protest, but she had seen the look in his eyes before and knew that she would get nothing more out of him. "Fine. So what do we do now?" Tomas held out a hand which she grasped. He pulled her to her feet and handed over her daggers. As soon as she touched the hilts, the enchanted spellblade metal soothed the ache in her head and calmed her stomach. "We rescue a prince," he said.